Our next speaker is Tony Wood. I first met Tony in 2008 when he was transitioning from one of our major energy companies to take a leading role in the Garneau Climate Change Review. He's now the director of the energy program at the Grattan Institute. And Tony, I think you will talk on climate and energy policy in 2016. Over to you.
Thanks, Frank. Energy security is an interesting question. Last week I was talking to someone who, a senior bureaucrat from a country I probably shouldn't name, and we were discussing why the Europeans were so interested in importing LNG from the United States when they had a lot of LNG coming from the east. And the answer was, well, there's only two reasons about this Russian gas. One is it's Russian and the other is gas. And then you're talking about what happens in Australia, because you need to explain to people outside Australia that in fact the way energy is considered in Australia, we actually have about 7 sovereign states, all of whom play off against each other in relation to policy and sometimes don't trust each other. And any of you have ever heard an energy minister from Queensland talk about how they're prepared to sell electricity to those bastards in New South Wales but not buy it from them, gives you an idea of the sort of tensions that sometimes arise in our very democratic federal system. So, this is the way many of us would like to think that climate and energy policy interact. I'll leave it to you to decide which one you think is climate and which one is energy, but they're supposed to mesh reasonably smoothly together. And there'd be many people, including the sort of work that Frank and I did back in 2008, would suggest this is possible. And all we needed to do was buy the product that the Garneau Review was selling, and life would go on quite smoothly and nothing much would happen. Well, unfortunately, things are turning out a little bit different, and those of us observing how this is unfolding increasingly become a little concerned about how these interact. So what I want to talk a little bit about are some of the factors that are likely to decide whether or not we end up with a smooth meshing or something that was a bit more like the train wreck. And just to make sure we're all familiar with what's going on at the moment in Australia, firstly, electricity and electricity consumption in this country had been falling consistently over the last 5 years, and many people firstly were surprised to find out that's what was going on, because all their decisions about regulation and prices and investment was on the basis that everything was going up. And we found out that we didn't even understand some of the assumptions that underpinned the way the electricity market worked, that were built upon the assumption that rising demand would take care of most problems. And so we just merrily kept on our way until what happened in most of this chart started to unfold. And now what's happened, interestingly, only in the last 6 months, the whole bloody thing's turning around again. My suspicion is by the time our regulatory and policy setting catches up with falling demand will be rising again. And then we'll have another version of the problem we just think we're trying to solve. The major kick-up in the right-hand side of this graph is basically caused by Queensland, but interestingly, pretty much every state in Australia, that falling consumption had flattened out and was starting to even tick up slightly. And there are lots of various detailed reasons for that on both sides, which I won't go into on the right-hand side of this chart. The second thing is that during this phase, because of falling consumption and the forcing in new supply, namely renewable energy, what we've seen is low and volatile wholesale prices. This creates, not surprisingly, some challenges for those who compete in the wholesale market, namely the electricity generators. And this is not unique in the world. Most large generators in most parts of the world have been suffering from low wholesale prices, and there'll be many people in the community and in consumer groups who would say, and so bloody well about time. But you could have your different views about whether that's a good thing or not. The other thing, of course, is that despite the fact wholesale prices have been low and volatile, retail prices have been going up. You can see on this chart the impact of the carbon price, but interestingly, when the carbon price was removed, prices just kept going up. And there was some hope back last year that we would see some relief from that, but those of you who might have read the Australian Competition Tribunal's decision, I'm sure everyone's read the 300-page detail, which is written in financial and legal gobbledygook, most of it, but anyone who wants to unpick that this is no longer going to be the case. We're not going to see major reductions in the excess of $100 a customer per year. We're more likely to see small increases. Seems to me, while the process has been followed, the outcome is a very unsatisfactory one. And then finally, in terms of these interesting charts, the top left-hand side shows you what's been going on with Australia's total emissions in the electricity sector. They more or less had risen after the removal of the carbon price and have now sort of flattened out a bit, although they did again increase last year in 2015 versus 2014. And the bottom right-hand chart here shows you basically the emissions intensity of the sector. The reason the bottom right-hand one's got that wobble in it basically is because it does have a seasonality component, which the top left-hand one doesn't. So we've seen falling consumption, we've seen flat wholesale prices, we've seen rising emissions, and we've certainly seen rising emissions intensity back to where it was more or less before the carbon price was imposed. So the question is, this looks to me anything but a smooth transition when I think about climate change and energy policy. I would not even attempt to suggest that either of those cartoon faces represent the Energy Minister or the Climate Change Minister today, although you can guess which ones you think are more appropriate. There are two things, it seems to me, about this that are worth thinking about as these two systems grind together either as a smooth meshing or as a train wreck. One is that the current problem with credibility of climate policy, I think, is more serious than many of us would like to think. What I mean by that is that because we had such a toxic debate in this country around climate change policy, it seems to me very difficult for any government to set a credible climate change policy into the future. Because no one who has to invest will seriously believe, in terms of, if belief means putting my money behind it, in that climate change policy. And so what you're going to see is increasing noise that says, we're not going to do that, and therefore you need to do something else to make us do it. And there's two things you could do. One is you could do as the United Kingdom is doing, and basically write long-term contracts to buy electricity from low emission sources and commit future generations to very high electricity prices on the assumption you know, as government, what the world's going to look like in 2050. Now, given the capacity of governments and their agencies and even industry to predict gas prices, electricity prices and demand, I would suggest that is a long shot indeed, but that's what the UK is doing. They've just given up on markets and are going to a centrally planned approach to climate change. The second one you can do is regulate to cause other changes. So we've got subsidies for renewable energy. We can basically regulate to remove the existing generation. That's a perfectly plausible thing to do, but again, it seems to me a sad reflection of where we've come to in relation to setting anything like credible climate change policy. So we've given up, I think, largely on how we do this. There are opportunities to regain that ground, but because of that history, I think they're more difficult. And the second of the 2 points I wanted to make, and that is relating to the way in which the electricity market responds to increasing proportions of intermittent low margin supply. It doesn't matter whether it's renewable or not, that's not the point. In fact, I would tend to avoid using the word renewable if I could in most presentations. The Chinese, in their market reform process, have called it opening up the ends and squeezing the middle. What they mean by that is wholesale competition, retail competition, and transmission and distribution regulation. And the wholesale market broadly around the world has followed a similar model, and that is you provide an incentive for businesses to compete on the wholesale market. They put forward prices on a very detailed half-hourly basis, and they basically compete on the basis of marginal cost. And depending on the detail of the way that market's designed, you get change in merit order, depending on the times of day, the time of year, and people make money about the way that market works. And largely speaking, it's worked very well. And it was designed very well for the circumstances we had in Australia in the late 1990s and the first part of this century. That is a market in which we have predominantly, and still do of course, energy supply with a very high, with a significant proportion of marginal cost, that is the fuel, and not much anything else. Now what's happening is we're now seeing a situation in which, as we move towards a very different future, that market may no longer be suitable for the new purpose, and that is to end up with a situation in which we have effectively very low, high proportions of very low marginal cost supply. That means, if you can think about a marginal cost curve, which I didn't attempt to draw here, what you end up is instead of having prices that go up proportionally with different forms of fuel, everything basically has a flat marginal price, close to zero. That's a very different situation. And the way you solve that problem is not trivial or straightforward. A number of countries around the world are grappling with exactly the same problem. And so when we look at all these policies, we think about, and I'm not going to go through this in anything like detail, but it can come back to the questions if you like. One is, well, what are the sort of policies on the top right-hand side here? You can see some of the policy choices that Australian government has grappled with in the last few years, both the Coalition and the Labor Party in government and in opposition, still grappling with these issues. The way we think you have to consider them, on the top left-hand side in terms of what the relative pluses and minuses might be. And the two that I've asterisked there, it seems to us, are in 2016 almost more important than the rest. Because it turns out that the way you design the detailed policies on the economics can be very important, but probably the end of it don't matter as much as whether you actually make a start to actually do something about addressing climate change, rather than debating endlessly the minutiae around the economic modelling of each of the different alternatives. There are some significant, not central but important transitional issues on that left-hand side, many of which are very important to either consumers or to investors or to industrial emitters. And on the right-hand side is, I think, some of the political background in which this takes place. And I do not want to suggest that that's a bad outcome, it's just the way the world works. So finally, what does this all look like in terms of where we are today? We see a system that is being challenged on a whole range of fronts. I think we're seeing a renewable energy target, for example, which may or not be achieved. It was a poisonous debate in 2014-15. It was sort of resolved, but not really, and you'll get almost as many views on whether that target will be achieved as there are people prepared to give you their view. We're seeing, as I said before, I think, some challenges to this energy market that are not being taken sufficiently seriously by the people who are responsible for the governance of our structure. In our view, and this is a broad comment, so I'll just throw it out there and move on, that is, I think, one of the problems is the fundamental governance structure by which the markets are set, reviewed and regulated is where the problem starts. If we don't fix it at the top, then it's unlikely that the Australian Energy Regulator or the Australian Energy Market Commission or the Australian Energy Market Operator will be able to get it right. They'll just follow their rules as they're supposed to do, and the end result will not necessarily be something we want. And then some of the more details, we've got this issue of cost-effective network pricing. We're supposed to do the sort of things and give people the sort of incentives to do the stuff that Steve was talking about, and yet only a month ago we had the Victorian Minister walk away from that commitment to cost-effective tariff pricing. And smart meters, we've got a state in Victoria where we basically put a smart meter on every house, except those people who thought that smart meters would fry their kids' brains. And we've now got them there, but we're not getting the maximum benefit because the state government has basically pushed back on taking the opportunity that cost-reflective pricing and smart meters could deliver in combination. And then finally, I think for us, when you talk to people outside Australia, they're absolutely bemused about the way in which the role of gas is played out in this country. For a country that's about to become the largest exporter of LNG in the world, to find itself in a situation in which gas is being priced out of our domestic market seems a really, really weird outcome. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions to Tony, but first of all, I have a question to you collectively, right? So Tony's first slide, we had two cogwheels, a small one and a large one. Right? One of them is climate, one of them is energy. Which one is the large one? All of those who think that the large one is climate policy, say aye. All of those who think that energy policy is the large one, say aye. Aye. I think the energy has it.
I was going to say, I think your eyes had it, but anyway.
Okay, couple of questions for Tony, or one even.
Tony, David Haviett from Energy Consumers Australia. It is easy to conclude, as you have, that our convoluted governance model for energy is creating serious issues in terms of being able to make an energy policy that matches our climate obligations. Given our climate obligations are now covered by international treaties, is it time for the foreign affairs power to be used for the Commonwealth to take control?
Yeah, I guess we're when you look at this stuff, one of the difficulties is you've got to start from here. And so, whether you would like to remove the, we've got national markets supposedly for electricity and gas, and yet we have a federal system that basically interferes with those markets. We have policies that are put in place that interfere with those markets. So there is the absence of state politics would be an interesting challenge if that's what you're getting at. But I think that's likely to happen anytime soon. I do think that the integration of energy and climate policy, which has been at least given word or sound commitment by the COAG Energy Council, we're seeing greater interaction between the federal departments on environment and energy, and also the moves towards better cooperation than we've seen for a long time between energy and climate change are all positive. But how that plays out in reality, I think, is still a challenge, because we've seen lots of good words about governance before, and yet I would suggest that the governance structure around our energy markets is failing us quite badly. And unless we get that right, the chances of fixing it below that are difficult. So I would suggest we have got no choice except to work at a federal level, but whether or not the current Energy Minister, Josh Frydenberg, has the capacity to bring his state colleagues and his federal colleagues with him, I think is still a challenge, but I don't see how you've got any choice except to try and make that work.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned very quickly the increase in electricity demand in Queensland. Could you please expound on the reasons why that happened?
It's just the LNG exports. They suck a lot of electricity out of the system.